Long after the others were gone, one survivor still quietly carried the memories of that day. He did not seek cameras, he did not seek fame, he rarely spoke of what happened at all. His name was Werner Dohner, and until the day he died, he was the final living witness to 34 seconds that changed the history of air travel forever. This is not just the story of an airship, it is the story of an 8-year-old boy who was thrown from a burning airship by his mother's hands and who carried that memory silently for the rest of his life. Picture the sky above New Jersey on the evening of May 6, 1937. A massive silver shape hangs above the airfield, longer than 2 football fields, drifting down toward its mooring mast. Crowds wait below with cameras and newsreel crews. Then, in an instant, the sky itself seems to ignite. What the crowd witnesses next will become one of the most infamous scenes in 20th century history. But before that moment, there is a story that begins years earlier in a very different world, and with one family who almost didn't take this flight at all. In the 1930s, no nation invested more heavily in airship travel than Germany. The Zeppelin program had been a source of national pride since before the First World War, and by the 1930s it had become a symbol the German government was eager to showcase to the world. The Hindenburg, officially designated LZ-129, was the largest flying machine ever built. It carried passengers across the Atlantic faster than any ship afloat, and it did so in astonishing luxury. Private cabins, a dining room with fine china, even a pressurized smoking lounge sealed off to prevent any spark from escaping. For the wealthy and the well-connected, it was the most glamorous way to cross an ocean the world had ever seen. But beneath that glamour sat a quiet compromise that few passengers ever thought to question. The Hindenburg was designed to be filled with helium, a safe, inert lifting gas that could not burn. Helium in the 1930s, however, was almost exclusively produced in the United States, and American law at the time restricted its export, partly out of concern that it could end up serving military purposes for a rearming Nazi Germany. Denied helium, the airship's operators turned to hydrogen instead. Hydrogen lifted just as well, and it was cheap and plentiful. It was also far more flammable. Few passengers thought much about it, but every flight the Hindenburg made depended on that one dangerous compromise. It flew with hydrogen instead of helium. Among the passengers boarding for the return crossing to America in the spring of 1937 was a German family who no longer even lived in Germany. Werner Dohner was born on March 14, 1929, in Darmstadt, but by the time of this flight, his family had settled in Mexico City, where his father worked as an executive for a pharmaceutical company. The Dohners had become naturalized Mexican citizens, building a new life across the ocean from where they had started, far from the political tensions rising in the country they had left behind. In the spring of 1937, they returned to Germany for a family visit, reconnecting with relatives and revisiting the country of Werner's birth. Now they were heading home aboard the most famous airship in the world, a fitting way, it must have seemed, to end a memorable trip. Werner traveled with his mother, his father, his older brother, and his older sister. He was 8 years old, and to him, the flight was less about geopolitics or engineering than it was an adventure. Long promenades with slanted windows for viewing the ocean below, the hum of engines, the strange sensation of floating rather than flying. For a child, the Hindenburg was not a symbol of national prestige or a triumph of German engineering. It was simply the most exciting way home he could imagine, a floating hotel in the sky, carrying his family back to the life they had built for themselves an ocean away. The Hindenburg departed Frankfurt on May 3, 1937, beginning what should have been a routine transatlantic crossing. For most of the journey, everything unfolded exactly as passengers expected from Germany's flagship airship. The Atlantic crossing was calm. Passengers strolled the promenade decks, dined in the elegant restaurant, and slept in private cabins as the ship cruised steadily westward. Werner and his siblings spent much of the flight the way children do on any long journey, exploring the corridors, pressing their faces to the slanted windows, watching the ocean pass silently below. There was no sense, even among the crew, that anything was wrong. This was simply another flight, one of dozens the Hindenburg had already completed without incident. As the airship approached the United States, the weather turned uncooperative. Thunderstorms rolled through the area near Lakehurst, New Jersey, where the ship was due to moor. The captain made the prudent decision to delay landing, circling and waiting for the storms to clear rather than risk a landing in poor conditions. It was a decision made out of caution. Hours later, with the weather improved, the Hindenburg finally began its final approach toward the mooring mast at Lakehurst Naval Air Station. Ground crews stood ready. Mooring lines were dropped. Passengers gathered near the windows to watch the landing, many of them filming the moment with their own cameras, eager to capture the end of their journey. Among them was Werner's father, who had gone to fetch his movie camera so he could film the ship's arrival, a small, ordinary decision that would end up mattering more than he could have known. Then, in the final moments of that ordinary landing procedure, everything changed. Witnesses on the ground would later describe flames appearing near the tail of the airship, followed by fire spreading through the hull with terrifying speed. It was not, contrary to the way it is often remembered, a single explosion. It was a chain reaction, the hydrogen inside the ship's cells catching and burning in a matter of seconds, consuming the entire structure from one end to the other in roughly half a minute. To this day, historians have never conclusively proven what ignited it. The leading theory involves a static electric discharge meeting leaking hydrogen gas during the ship's final approach, but no definitive answer has ever closed the case. What is certain is what happened next, inside the passenger decks, as the fire spread and the ship began its collapse toward the ground. Werner Donner's family was near a window when the fire broke out. In the chaos of those final seconds, his mother made a decision that would define the rest of Werner's life. She threw his older brother out through the window toward the ground below. Then she threw Werner. Then she jumped after them herself. There was no time to save everyone. Werner's older sister did not make it out, nor did his father, who had gone to retrieve his movie camera only moments before the fire. Werner Donner would later describe that moment in words that became among his most quoted recollections. Suddenly, the air was on fire. It is a simple sentence, almost understated, and perhaps that is why it has endured. It does not attempt to dramatize what happened. It simply describes, through the eyes of an 8-year-old boy, the instant his world turned to flame. Outside, on the ground at Lakehurst, a radio reporter narrating the landing for a live broadcast watched the same scene unfold and struggled to find words for what he was seeing, his voice cracking as the ship collapsed toward the earth in a column of smoke and fire. That recording would go on to become one of the most recognized pieces of audio in American broadcasting history, replayed for generations as the sound of the disaster itself. But inside the ship, there was no broadcast, no audience, no narration. There was only a family, seconds from the ground, and a mother making an impossible choice about which of her children she could reach first. Werner survived, but not without cost. He suffered severe burns across his body, damage to one ear, and injuries that impaired his vision. He required numerous skin grafts and remained hospitalized until January of the following year, nearly 8 months after the disaster. An 8-year-old boy spending most of a year in and out of surgery, recovering from injuries most adults would struggle to endure. His mother survived as well, though she too carried physical and emotional scars, the price of the seconds she'd spent choosing which child to save first. His father and his sister did not. When the full toll of the disaster was counted, the numbers told a story more complicated than the popular memory of the event suggests. 97 people had been aboard the Hindenburg that day. 35 of them died, along with one member of the ground crew struck by the falling wreckage, bringing the total death toll to 36. 62 people aboard survived. It was a catastrophe without question, one that effectively ended the era of commercial passenger Zeppelin travel almost overnight. But it was not, as it is sometimes remembered, an event in which everyone perished. The majority of those aboard walked away, many of them badly injured, all of them forever changed. For Werner Donner, survival marked the beginning of a very different kind of story, one far quieter than the fire that made him briefly famous. Unlike some survivors who spent decades giving interviews and appearing at commemorations, Werner mostly avoided the spotlight. He built an ordinary life, the kind that rarely makes headlines but quietly carries on in the background of history. He trained as an electrical engineer and worked first in Mexico, later in Ecuador, before eventually moving to the United States in 1984. He spent years working for the New England Electric System, a career built on precision and steadiness, before retiring in 1999. Those who knew him described a hard-working man, a devoted father, someone who rarely brought up the events of that May evening unless asked directly. He did not build his identity around the disaster. He did not seek to be known as a survivor. For most of his life, colleagues and even some friends had little idea that the quiet, methodical engineer beside them had once been thrown from a burning airship as a child. His son would later say that the trauma of that day remained buried deep within him, rarely spoken of, never fully resolved. It was simply carried, year after year, the way people often carry the heaviest things, silently, and mostly alone. As the decades passed, the circle of people who remembered the Hindenburg firsthand grew smaller and smaller. Werner Franz, the airship's 14-year-old cabin boy who had also survived the fire, died in 2014, closing the chapter on surviving crew members. Frank Ward, the last surviving member of the ground crew, died in 2015. One by one, the eyewitnesses to one of aviation's defining tragedies disappeared until only one remained. Werner Donner, the 8-year-old boy thrown from a burning airship by his mother's hands, had become the last living survivor of the Hindenburg disaster. He had not asked for that distinction. He had spent most of his life avoiding it, but by simply outliving everyone else who had been aboard that evening, he became something he never set out to be. The final living connection to an event that the rest of the world knew only through photographs, newsreels, and a famous radio broadcast. Werner Donner died on November 8, 2019, at the age of 90. The cause was pneumonia. His death did not make headlines the way the disaster once had, but for historians, it marked something significant. The last first-hand chapter of the Hindenburg story had closed. What remains is not the wreckage or the famous newsreel footage, but the quieter image underneath it. A mother making an impossible choice in a burning window, a father who never finished filming the landing he'd waited to capture, and one small boy who carried the memory of a few burning seconds for more than 80 years without ever needing to say much about it at all. His life afterward, steady, private, devoted to his own family, said what words never could. That is the truest legacy of the Hindenburg. Not the engineering, not the hydrogen, not the headlines, but the ordinary people forced to keep living in the shadow of a single afternoon in New Jersey. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Dead Empires for more.